The blade felt heavier than usual against Lyra's thigh as she approached the towering obsidian gates of the Imperial Palace. Each step on the marble floor echoed through the vast corridors, a rhythmic reminder of the countless missions that had brought her to this moment. 23 years of training, of conditioning, of becoming the Empire's most lethal asset, all leading to this final assignment that would either cement her legacy or destroy everything she had ever known. Endash. Commander Thorn waited in the war room, his scarred face illuminated by the ethereal glow of tactical maps suspended in midair. The magical projections showed the contested territories where the Fae Rebellion had gained ground, their forces marked in shimmering silver against the Empire's deep crimson. Lyra had memorized every detail of these maps during her years of service, but tonight they held a different significance. Tonight, they would guide her to her target. Lyra Shadowmere. Thorn's voice carried the weight of authority earned through decades of warfare. Your reputation precedes you, as always. The Council has deliberated, and your final mission has been decided. He gestured to the largest projection, where a single figure stood out among the strategic markers. General Caelum Nightwhisper of the Fae Rebellion. Their greatest military mind, their most beloved leader, and our most dangerous enemy. The holographic image rotated slowly, revealing a face that seemed carved from moonlight itself. High cheekbones, silver hair that caught light like spun starfire, and eyes that held the depth of ancient forests. Lyra had studied countless targets over the years, but something about this one made her pause. Perhaps it was the way his expression seemed to carry both strength and sorrow, or the subtle lines around his eyes that spoke of burdens carried too long. He's younger than I expected, she observed, her voice carefully neutral. The Empire's intelligence had painted him as an ancient strategist, but the man before her appeared to be in his prime, though she knew Fae aging worked differently than human years. Don't let appearances deceive you, Thorn warned. Caelum has been leading the rebellion for over a century. His tactical genius has cost us 3 major cities and countless lives. The Council believes that his death would shatter their resistance entirely. He paused, studying Lyra's face for any sign of hesitation. This is not a battlefield assassination, Shadowmere. This requires finesse, infiltration, and trust building. You'll need to get close enough to strike when he's completely vulnerable. Lyra nodded, her training automatically cataloging the mission parameters. Infiltration meant assuming a false identity, building relationships, and maintaining her cover for weeks or potentially months. It was the most dangerous type of assignment because it required not just physical skill, but emotional control. She had to become someone else entirely while never forgetting who she truly was. "What's my cover?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "You'll be Ilara Moonfall, a half-Fae refugee seeking sanctuary with the rebellion. Your human mother was supposedly killed in an Imperial raid, driving you to seek revenge against the Empire." Thorn handed her a leather portfolio containing forged documents, backstory details, and intelligence reports. You'll have enough genuine emotion to make the story believable, and enough Fae blood to pass their magical scrutiny. The mention of her mixed heritage sent a familiar chill through Lyra's chest. Her Fae mother had been a captured prisoner of war, her human father an Imperial soldier who had shown mercy in a moment of weakness. The result had been a daughter who belonged fully to neither world, raised by the Empire to use her unique abilities against her mother's people. She had learned long ago not to dwell on the irony. "Timeline?" she inquired, accepting the portfolio with steady hands. "The winter solstice approaches, and intelligence suggests the rebellion is planning a major offensive. We need Caelum eliminated before then." Thorn's expression hardened. 6 weeks, Shadowmere. 6 weeks to infiltrate, gain his trust, and complete the mission. After that, you'll be extracted and can finally retire with honors. Retirement. The word felt foreign on her tongue, like a language she had never learned to speak. For over 2 decades, she had known only missions, targets, and the constant dance between life and death. The promise of a peaceful existence somewhere far from the war felt both tempting and terrifying. "Understood, Commander," she replied, tucking the portfolio into her coat. "I'll need 3 days to prepare and memorize my new identity. You have 2, Thorn corrected. The window for insertion is narrow, and our contacts in the rebellion won't be able to maintain their positions much longer. You leave tomorrow night." As Lyra left the war room, the weight of her final mission settled over her like a familiar cloak. She had killed generals before, politicians, spies, and anyone else the Empire deemed a threat, but something about this assignment felt different, though she couldn't identify why. Perhaps it was the prospect of freedom waiting on the other side, or perhaps it was the way Caelum's holographic eyes had seemed to look directly at her across the space between them. Her apartment in the intelligence district was spartanly furnished, containing only the essentials needed for her cover identities and weapons maintenance. She spread the mission documents across her dining table, studying every detail of Ilara Moonfall's fabricated life. The backstory was compelling, tragic enough to explain her desperation, detailed enough to withstand scrutiny, and flexible enough to adapt to unexpected situations. According to her new history, Ilara had been raised in a small border town where humans and Fae had lived in relative harmony before the war intensified. Her mother, Celestine, had been a skilled healer who had tried to remain neutral in the conflict until Imperial forces had accused her of treating rebellion wounded. The supposed raid that killed her had been brutal and thorough, leaving Ilara with nothing but rage and a burning desire for revenge. Lyra spent the next day immersing herself in the role, practicing the subtle changes in posture and speech that would transform her from an Imperial assassin into a grieving half-Fae refugee. She adjusted her magical signature to match someone untrained in combat, suppressed the predatory grace that marked her as a killer, and cultivated the desperate hope that would make her seem like a genuine recruit to the Rebellion's cause. The transformation was more than physical. She had to believe in Ilara's story, at least partially, or the Fae's natural empathic abilities would detect the deception. So she allowed herself to access memories of her own mother, not the captured Fae warrior, but the gentle woman who had sung lullabies in the old language before the Empire had claimed her daughter completely. As night fell, Lyra gathered her equipment with practiced efficiency. The poison blade went into a hidden sheath at her thigh, its edge coated with a toxin that would stop a Fae heart within minutes. Her backup weapons were concealed throughout her clothing and gear, each one chosen for its lethality and concealability. Finally, she donned the simple traveler's clothes that marked her as a refugee, complete with carefully crafted tears and stains that told the story of a desperate journey. The extraction point was a clearing in the Thornwood Forest, where the boundary between Imperial and Rebellion territory blurred into a dangerous no-man's land. Lyra moved through the darkness with the silent grace of a predator, her enhanced senses alert for any sign of patrol activity. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that something significant was about to unfold. She reached the designated coordinates just as the moon reached its zenith, casting silver light through the canopy above. According to the intelligence reports, Rebellion scouts regularly patrolled this area, looking for refugees and potential recruits. All she had to do was wait and allow herself to be discovered. The sound of approaching footsteps made her tense, every instinct screaming at her to fade into the shadows and strike from concealment. Instead, she forced herself to remain visible, to appear vulnerable and desperate. 3 figures emerged from the undergrowth, their movements marking them as experienced fighters despite their attempt at stealth. "Please," Lyra called out, injecting just the right amount of fear and hope into her voice. "I'm looking for the rebellion. I need to speak with someone in authority." The lead scout, a tall Fae woman with intricate tattoos covering her arms, studied Lyra with calculating eyes. "Many people claim to seek us out," she said carefully. "Few have honest intentions. What makes you different?" "My mother was Celestine Moonfall," Lyra replied, allowing genuine emotion to color her words. "She was murdered by Imperial forces 3 weeks ago. I have information they might want, and I want to help fight back." The scouts exchanged glances, and Lyra caught the subtle hand signals they used to communicate. Her training allowed her to interpret their meaning. They recognized the name, which meant the Empire's intelligence network had woven Celestine's identity into existing rebellion records. The preparation was thorough, as always. "We'll escort you to the nearest safe house," the lead scout decided. "But know this: if you're lying, if you're a spy, we'll know. The general has ways of seeing through deception." As they began moving deeper into rebellion territory, Lyra felt the first stirrings of anticipation. Soon, she would meet her target face to face, begin the delicate process of gaining his trust, and ultimately complete the mission that would define her entire career. The General Caelum Nightwhisper, strategic genius and beloved leader of the Fae Rebellion, had no idea that his death was already walking toward him through the moonlit forest. The safe house appeared to be nothing more than a woodcutter's cabin, but Lyra's trained eye caught the subtle signs of fortification and the magical wards that protected it from detection. The scouts led her inside, where a fire crackled in the hearth, and simple furniture suggested this was a way station rather than a permanent residence. "Wait here," the lead scout instructed. "Someone will come to interview you properly. Don't try to leave, the woods are dangerous at night, and not just because of Imperial patrols." Alone in the cabin, Lyra allowed herself a moment to assess her situation. The mission had begun successfully, but this was only the first step in a complex operation. She needed to convince whoever interviewed her that she was genuine, gain passage to wherever Caelum was located, and then begin the careful process of infiltration and trust building. She didn't have to wait long. The door opened without a sound, and a figure stepped into the firelight that made Lyra's breath catch in her throat. It was him, General Caelum Nightwhisper himself. Though he wore simple traveling clothes rather than military regalia, the holographic projection hadn't captured the full impact of his presence, the way he seemed to command attention without effort, or the subtle aura of power that surrounded him like a second skin. "Ilara Moonfall," he said, and his voice carried the musical quality common to all Fae, but there was something deeper beneath it, a weariness that spoke of too many battles fought and too many losses mourned. "I am General Bay. Caelum. I knew your mother." The statement hit Lyra like a physical blow, though she managed to keep her expression neutral. The Empire's intelligence network was thorough, but they couldn't have predicted that Caelum would have a personal connection to her fabricated identity. She had to adapt quickly, use this unexpected advantage to her benefit. "You knew her?" she asked, allowing hope and desperation to color her voice. "Then you know what she was like, what she stood for." The Imperials killed her because she wouldn't abandon her principles, because she treated anyone who needed healing regardless of their allegiance. Caelum moved closer, and Lyra caught the scent of pine and winter air that seemed to cling to him. His eyes, even more striking in person than in the hologram, studied her face with an intensity that made her wonder if he could somehow see through her. Deception. "Celestine was one of the finest healers I ever knew," he said softly. "She saved my life once, during the Battle of Silverbrook. I've regretted not doing more to protect her ever since." He paused, and something like guilt flickered across his features. "I'm sorry for your loss, Ilara. Your mother was a remarkable woman." The genuine emotion in his voice caught Lyra off guard. She had expected cold calculation, military assessment, perhaps even suspicion. Instead, she found herself facing someone who seemed to carry the weight of courage. Every life lost in the war, who genuinely mourned the death of a woman who had never existed. The contradiction between the feared enemy general and the man before her was unsettling. "I want to help," she said, sticking to her prepared script. "I want to make the Empire pay for what they did to her, to all of us. I have information about Imperial troop movements, supply lines, things I observed during my journey here." Caelum nodded slowly, though his expression remained thoughtful. "Information is always valuable, but what we truly need are people willing to fight for something greater than revenge. The rebellion isn't just about opposing the Empire, it's about building a better world for everyone, human and Fae alike." His words carried a conviction that surprised Lyra. She had been expecting propaganda, rhetoric designed to manipulate potential recruits. Instead, she heard genuine belief, a vision of something beyond the endless cycle of violence that had defined her entire life. "What would you have me do?" she asked. "First, you'll need training," Caelum replied. "Not just in combat, but in our philosophy, our goals, our methods. The Empire teaches that strength comes from domination, but we believe it comes from cooperation and mutual support." He gestured toward the door. "I'll arrange for you to be transported to our main encampment. you'll find it's quite different from what Imperial propaganda claims. As they prepared to leave the safe house, Lyra found herself stealing glances at her target. Everything about him contradicted her expectations, his gentle manner with the cabin's other occupants, his obvious concern for her well-being as a refugee, his tendency to listen more than he spoke. This was the feared general who had outmaneuvered Imperial forces for over a century. But he seemed more like a teacher or a counselor than a military leader. The journey to the rebellion encampment took 3 days, during which Lyra had numerous opportunities to study Caelum and his companions. She watched him help an injured scout, mediate a dispute between 2 soldiers, and spend long hours studying tactical reports by firelight. Each observation added another layer to her understanding of the man she was supposed to kill. The encampment itself was a revelation. Rather than the rough military installation she had expected, it resembled a small city carved from the living forest. Tree houses connected by bridges and walkways housed families with children, workshops where artisans created both weapons and beautiful objects, and gathering areas where people of all ages came together to share meals and stories. "Welcome to Haven," Caelum said, noting her expression of surprise. "Our home, our hope, and our promise to the future." Lyra realized that her mission had just become infinitely more complicated. She wasn't just being asked to kill a general, she was being asked to destroy the heart of a community, to shatter the dreams of thousands of people who had found refuge and purpose in this hidden sanctuary. The weight of that responsibility settled over her like a heavy cloak. Her quarters were simple but comfortable. A small treehouse with a view of the encampment's central gathering area. From her window, she could see children playing games that seemed to blend human and Fae traditions, their laughter echoing through the forest canopy. The sight stirred something in her chest that she couldn't quite identify, a longing for something she had never experienced. A life that had been stolen from her before she was old enough to understand what she was losing. Training began the next morning, but it wasn't the harsh conditioning she had expected. Instead, her instructors focused on teaching her about the rebellion's history, their goals, and their methods. She learned about the Council of Voices, where decisions were made through consensus rather than decree, about the way they had integrated human and Fae communities, about their vision of a world where children could grow up without fear of war. Caelum appeared regularly during her training, not as a distant commander but as a teacher and guide. He helped her understand the complexities of Fae magic, shared stories of the war that revealed its true cost, and listened when she spoke about her supposed experiences as a refugee. His presence was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because he genuinely seemed to care about her well-being. Unsettling because it made her mission increasingly difficult to contemplate. "You're progressing well," he told her after a particularly intensive session on battlefield tactics, "but I sense you're holding something back. You move like someone with combat experience, despite claiming to be untrained." The observation made Lyra's heart race, but she managed to maintain her cover. "My mother taught me some basic self-defense," she lied smoothly. She said that in times like these, everyone needed to know how to protect themselves. Caelum nodded, accepting the explanation, though something in his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Your mother was wise. But remember, true strength isn't just about fighting, it's about knowing when to fight and when to find another way." As the weeks passed, Lyra found herself drawn deeper into the life with Haven. She attended council meetings where complex decisions were debated with patience and respect, participated in cultural celebrations that blended human and Fae traditions, and slowly began to understand the vision that drove the rebellion. It wasn't just opposition to the Empire, it was a genuine attempt to create something better, something that honored both human determination and Fae harmony. More troubling was her growing attachment to Caelum himself. She had expected to find a cold strategist, a commander who viewed his followers as pawns in a larger game. Instead, she discovered someone who genuinely cared about every person under his protection, who carried the weight of command with grace and humility, who seemed to see something in her that she didn't even recognize in herself. The turning point came during her 4th week in Haven, when a scouting party returned with disturbing news. An Imperial force was approaching the encampment, larger than any they had previously encountered. The scout reports suggested it was a search and destroy mission, designed to eliminate Haven entirely. "We need to evacuate," one of the council members urged during the emergency meeting. "If we move quickly, we can save most of our people." "And go where?" another responded. "This is our home, our sanctuary. If we abandon it, we'll be refugees again, scattered and vulnerable." Caelum listened to the debate with characteristic patience, but Lyra could see the weight of decision pressing down on him. The choice wasn't just tactical, it was about preserving hope itself, about maintaining the dream that had brought all these people together. "There's another option," he said finally. "We can fight, not to destroy but to protect, to show the Empire that we won't be driven away from what we've built." The debate continued for hours, but Lyra found herself studying Caelum's face rather than listening to the arguments. She saw the pain in his eyes, the way his shoulders carried the burden of leadership, the subtle signs of exhaustion that spoke of too many nights spent planning and worrying. This wasn't the monster she had been sent to eliminate. This was a man who had sacrificed everything for his people's future. When the meeting finally ended, Lyra followed Caelum to his private quarters, a modest treehouse that served as both home and office. The walls were lined with books and tactical maps, but she also noticed personal touches, a painting of what might have been his family, a collection of stones from different battlefields, a small garden where he grew herbs for healing. "You seem troubled," he observed, pouring 2 cups of tea from a kettle that steamed over a small fire. "I am," she admitted, accepting the cup with hands that trembled slightly. "I've never been part of something like this before. Something worth protecting. The thought of losing it terrifies me." Caelum settled into a chair across from her, his expression soft with understanding. "Fear is natural when you have something to lose, but don't let it paralyze you. Tomorrow we'll need every person fighting not just for survival, but for the future we're trying to build." "How do you bear it?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. "The responsibility? The weight of all these lives depending on your decisions?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his tea as if the answers might be found in its depths. "I remind myself that I'm not fighting for glory or conquest," he said finally. "I'm fighting for the children who play in our gardens, for the families who have found peace here, for the dream of a world where people like your mother don't have to die for showing compassion." The sincerity in his voice made Lyra's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. She had spent her entire life in service to the Empire, believing that her sacrifices were necessary for some greater good. But sitting here, listening to Caelum speak about his vision of the future, she began to question everything she had ever been taught. "What if you're wrong?" she asked quietly. "What if this dream is impossible? What if people can't change? What if the war goes on forever?" Caelum looked up at her, and for a moment she saw past the general's mask to the man beneath someone who had wondered the same things, who had wrestled with doubt and despair, who had chosen hope despite having every reason to wan. "Surrender to cynicism." "Then at least we tried," he said simply. "At least we proved that another way was possible, even if only for a little while. Sometimes that's enough." As the night deepened, they talked about everything and nothing: philosophy and tactics, memories and dreams, the weight of choices and the cost of war. Lyra found herself sharing stories from her fabricated past, but also revealing glimpses of her real experiences, carefully disguised but emotionally honest. Caelum listened with the kind of attention that made her feel truly seen for the first time in her life. When she finally returned to her quarters, the poisoned blade at her thigh felt heavier than ever. Tomorrow the Empire's forces would arrive, and in the chaos of battle, she would have the perfect opportunity to complete her mission. One strike, delivered with precision and stealth, would end Caelum's life and shatter the rebellion's resistance. It would be the culmination of everything she had been trained for, the final proof of her loyalty to the Empire. But as she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of Haven preparing for war, Lyra found herself wondering if she could actually do it. The man she had been sent to kill was nothing like the monster she had expected. He was kind, thoughtful, genuinely devoted to his people's well-being. Killing him would be like extinguishing a candle in a world already too full of darkness. She closed her eyes and tried to summon the cold professionalism that had sustained her through countless missions. She was Lyra Shadowmere, the Empire's deadliest weapon, trained from birth to put duty before all else. Personal feelings were a luxury she couldn't afford, a weakness that could compromise not just her mission but her life. But another voice whispered in the darkness, a voice that sounded suspiciously like her mother's lullabies in the old language. It asked her what she was really fighting for, what kind of world she wanted to leave behind, whether duty was worth the price of her soul. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the reality of impending battle. Lyra dressed in the simple armor provided by the rebellion, secured her weapons, and tried to prepare herself for what was to come. The encampment was already bustling with activity as families evacuated non-combatants to deeper forest sanctuaries, while fighters took their positions. She found Caelum in the command center, surrounded by maps and tactical displays, coordinating the defense with his lieutenants. He looked up as she entered, and his smile was warm despite the circumstances. "Alara," he said, using her false name with the same gentle tone he had used the night before. "I was hoping you'd volunteer for the reserve force. We'll need experienced people to protect the evacuation routes." The assignment was perfect for her purpose as it would keep her close to Caelum while providing cover for her true mission. She could wait for the right moment, strike during the chaos of battle, and disappear in the confusion. The Empire would have its victory, and she would have her freedom. "Of course," she replied, hating how easily the lie came. "Whatever you need." As the morning progressed, reports came in from the scouts tracking the Imperial advance. The force was larger than expected, well-equipped and moving with purpose. They knew exactly where Haven was located, which meant someone had betrayed its position. The realization sent a chill through the defenders. They were facing not just a military assault, but a coordinated attempt to destroy everything they had built. "We can still evacuate," one of the lieutenants suggested. "Hit them with delaying actions while the civilians escape to the deep forest sanctuaries." "No," Caelum said firmly. "If we run now, we'll never stop running. Haven isn't just a place, it's a symbol, a promise that we can build something better. We defend it here, or we lose everything that makes us who we are." "Wah." The conviction in his voice rallied the defenders, but Lyra could see the doubt in some of their faces. They were outnumbered, outgunned, facing the Empire's best soldiers in a battle that would determine the fate of the rebellion. Many of them wouldn't see another sunrise. As the hours passed, Lyra found herself assigned to a position that gave her a clear view of the command post, where Caelum would be coordinating the defense. The tactical situation was perfect during the height of the battle. When his attention was focused on the enemy, she could approach from behind and strike before anyone realized what was happening. The first explosions echoed through the forest as Imperial artillery began its bombardment. Ancient trees that had stood for centuries crashed to the ground, their destruction marking the beginning of the end for Haven. Lyra watched smoke rise from the residential areas and felt something twist in her chest. Those were homes being destroyed, lives being shattered, dreams being reduced to ash and debris. "They're advancing on the eastern perimeter," a scout reported, his voice tight with tension. "Heavy infantry, supported by battle mages. They're pushing hard toward the evacuation routes." Caelum studied the tactical display, his expression calm despite the chaos erupting around them. "Redirect the 3rd Company to reinforce the east. We need to buy more time for the civilians to reach safety." "Sir," one of his lieutenants protested, "that leaves the north flank exposed. If they break through there, then we'll deal with it," Caelum interrupted. "The civilians are our priority. Everything else is secondary." The decision was tactically questionable but morally absolute. Caelum was willing to risk military defeat to protect non-combatants, to sacrifice strategic advantage for the sake of innocent lives. It was exactly the kind of choice that made him beloved by his followers and feared by his enemies. As the battle intensified, Lyra found herself caught between two realities. Part of her remained focused on her mission, calculating angles and opportunities, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But another part was genuinely engaged in the defense, using her skills to protect the people she had come to care about, fighting alongside comrades who trusted her completely. The contradiction was tearing her apart. Every Imperial soldier she killed in defense of Haven was a betrayal of her true allegiance. Every life she saved was a step further from the person she had been trained to be. The war was no longer something happening around her, it was happening inside her, between duty and conscience, between the Empire's conditioning and her own emerging sense of right and wrong. Lyra! Caelum's voice cut through the sound of battle. I need you to take a message to the Eastern commanders. Tell them to begin a fighting withdrawal to the secondary positions. She nodded and began to move, but as she passed close to him, she caught the scent of blood. A quick glance revealed a wound on his left arm, probably from shrapnel, that he was trying to hide. The sight made her stop, though she couldn't say why. You're injured, she said. It's nothing, he replied, but she could see the pain in his eyes. The message is more important. Without thinking, she reached for him, her hands moving with practiced efficiency to examine the wound. It was deeper than it looked, the kind of injury that would only worsen if left untreated. Her training included field medicine, skills that could save his life or, she realized with a start, could be used to ensure he died from what should have been a minor wound. This needs attention, she said, tearing a strip from her own clothing to use as a bandage. You'll bleed out if we ignore it. As she worked, their faces were inches apart, and she could see the gratitude in his eyes. He trusted her completely, had no idea that the hands healing him were the same hands that had been sent to kill him. The intimacy of the moment was almost unbearable. Thank you, he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that had nothing to do with the chaos around them. I don't know what I would do without you. The words hit her like a physical blow. She had spent weeks earning his trust, building the relationship that would make her mission possible, but somewhere along the way, it had become real. The care in his voice, the way he looked at her, the gentle touch of his hand on hers, it wasn't just tactical anymore. It was genuine, and it was returned. You won't have to find out, she whispered, meaning it in ways she couldn't fully understand. The battle raged for hours, with the defenders giving ground slowly but steadily. The Imperial forces were professional and well-equipped, but they were fighting on unfamiliar terrain against people defending their homes. What should have been a quick victory turned into a grinding stalemate, with casualties mounting on both sides. As evening approached, Lyra found herself back at the command post, watching Caelum coordinate the defense with the calm efficiency that had made him legendary. He was magnificent in battle, not because of his skill with weapons, but because of his ability to inspire others, to make them believe that victory was possible even in the face of overwhelming odds. The civilians are clear, a lieutenant reported. All evacuated to the deep forest sanctuaries. Good, Caelum replied. Now we can focus on making this cost them more than they're willing to pay. It was the perfect moment. The mission was accomplished, the civilians were safe, the military situation was under control, and Caelum's attention was focused on the tactical display. Lyra could approach from behind, strike with a poisoned blade, and disappear in the confusion. The Empire would have its victory, the rebellion would lose its leader, and she would have completed her final mission. She moved closer, her hand finding the hidden blade at her thigh. The familiar weight of the weapon was comforting, a reminder of who she was and what she had been trained to do. All she had to do was draw it, strike once, and walk away. Simple, clean, efficient. But as she reached for the blade, she heard the sound of children laughing. Somewhere in the distance, probably in one of the forest sanctuaries, young voices were rising in some traditional Fae melody, but seemed to carry hope even in the midst of war. The sound made her freeze, her hand hovering over the weapon. Those children were alive because of the man in front of her. They had homes, families, futures, because Caelum had chosen to defend them rather than achieve military victory. He had built something beautiful in the middle of a war zone, had proven that another way was possible, had shown her what it meant to fight for something worth preserving. The blade felt impossibly heavy in her hand as she finally drew it. The poisoned edge caught the light from the command post's magical displays, a reminder of the death it carried. One strike, and everything would be over. One strike, and the Empire would reward her with freedom, with the quiet life she had always believed she wanted. But as she raised the weapon, Caelum turned around, perhaps sensing her presence. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. He saw the blade in her hand, saw the truth written in her expression, saw the woman she really was beneath the carefully constructed lies. Lyra Shadowmere, he said quietly, using her real name for the first time. The Empire's perfect weapon. She expected anger, betrayal, the rage of someone who had been deceived. Instead, she saw only sadness, not for himself, but for her. He understood what she had been sent to do, what she had been trained for, what she was still struggling to complete. "You knew," she whispered, the blade trembling in her hand. "I suspected," he replied. "Your skills were too advanced for a refugee, your knowledge too detailed for someone untrained. But I hoped I was wrong. I hoped that maybe, just maybe, you were exactly who you claimed to be." The confession broke something inside her. He had known she was a threat, had suspected she might be an assassin, but he had welcomed her anyway. He had treated her with kindness and respect, had shared his dreams and fears, had trusted her with his life even while knowing she might take it. "I'm sorry," she said, though the words felt inadequate. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be," Caelum replied, stepping closer despite the weapon in her hand. "You're not the first person the Empire has broken, and you won't be the last. The question is, who do you choose to be now?" The question hit her like a thunderbolt. For the first time in her life, she had a choice not about tactics or timing, but about who she wanted to be. She could complete her mission, honor her training, and return to the Empire as their perfect weapon. Or she could choose something else, something that terrified her more than any enemy she had ever faced. "I don't know how to be anyone else," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to be anything but what they made me." "Then learn," Caelum said gently. "Stay with us. Help us build something better. Show the Empire that their perfect weapon has become something they never expected, a person with the courage to choose hope over duty." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them, and one of Caelum's lieutenants appeared at the command post entrance. "Sir, we've received a surrender offer from the Imperial commander. They're willing to withdraw if we agree to." He stopped abruptly, taking in the scene before him, Lyra with the blade in her hand. Caelum standing calmly despite the obvious threat, the tension that crackled between them like lightning. "It's all right, Marcus," Caelum said, without taking his eyes off Lyra. "What are their terms?" The lieutenant glanced uncertainly between them, but continued with military professionalism. "They want safe passage for their wounded, and they're offering to leave our territory entirely if we agree not to pursue them." "And what do they want in return?" Caelum asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "They want the spy," Marcus replied grimly. "They know there's an Imperial asset among us, and they want her returned alive." The words hit Lyra like a physical blow. The Empire hadn't just sent her to kill Caelum, had planned for her capture, prepared to use her as a bargaining chip if the direct approach failed. She was expendable, a tool to be discarded when no longer useful. The realization that she had never been more than a weapon in their hands, never valued as a person, crystallized everything she had begun to feel about her life and choices. "Sir," Marcus continued, his hand moving to his weapon as he studied Lyra's stance. "Should I?" "No," Caelum said firmly. "Leave us. And Marcus, whatever happens here, the surrender offer is rejected. We don't negotiate with people who treat human beings as bargaining chips." The lieutenant hesitated, clearly torn between following orders and protecting his commander, but eventually withdrew. His footsteps faded into the distance, leaving them alone with the weight of decision hanging between them. "They'll kill you if you don't complete the mission," Caelum observed. "The Empire doesn't tolerate failure, especially not from their most valuable assets." "I know," Lyra whispered, the blade still trembling in her hand. "But I can't do it. I can't kill you. Not after everything I've seen, everything I've learned about who you really are." "Then what will you do?" he asked gently. "Because we both know you can't go back to being who you were before." The question forced her to confront the magnitude of her situation. She had betrayed the Empire by failing to complete her mission, but she had also betrayed the rebellion by infiltrating them under false pretenses. She belonged nowhere, was trusted by no one, had nothing but the skills that had made her a killer, and the growing certainty that she didn't want to be that person anymore. "I don't know," she admitted, lowering the blade finally. "I've spent my entire life following orders, being what other people needed me to be. I don't know how to choose for myself." Caelum stepped closer, his movements slow and non-threatening. "Then start small," he suggested. "Choose what you want to happen in the next 5 minutes. Choose whether you want to be someone who kills or someone who saves. Choose whether you want to serve the empire that made you or the people who welcomed you." The simplicity of his advice was profound. She didn't have to decide the rest of her life in this moment. She only had to decide what kind of person she wanted to be right now. And when she looked at Caelum, saw the kindness in his eyes and the hope he carried for everyone around him, the choice became clear. "I choose to save," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I choose to protect what we've built here, even if it means I can never go back to who I was." The smile that spread across Caelum's face was like sunrise after a long night. "Then welcome to the rebellion, Lyra Shadowmere. The real rebellion, not just against the Empire, but against everything that tries to make us less than we can be." As if summoned by her decision, the sound of renewed fighting echoed through the forest. The Imperial forces had apparently grown tired of waiting for a response to their surrender offer and were pressing their attack again. But this time, Lyra found herself on the right side of the battle, using her skills to protect rather than destroy. "We need to get to the front lines," Caelum said, his demeanor shifting back to that of a military commander. "If they're pushing again, it means they've received reinforcements or new orders. Either way, we need to be ready." As they moved through the forest toward the sound of battle, Lyra felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in her life, she was fighting for something she believed in, using her abilities to protect people she cared about. The fear was still there, fear of discovery, fear of retribution, fear of the unknown future, but it was overshadowed by a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. The battle was fierce, but brief. The Imperial forces, demoralized by their failure to achieve a quick victory and facing defenders who fought with renewed determination, began to withdraw as night fell. But as they retreated, Lyra caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. Imperial intelligence agents, recognizable by their distinctive black uniforms, were moving through the forest with purpose that had nothing to do with the military withdrawal. "Caelum," she called out, her voice tight with urgency. "We need to get everyone to the deep sanctuaries, now." "What is it?" he asked, following her gaze. "Death squads," she replied grimly. "Imperial Intelligence's cleanup crews. They're not here to capture territory, they're here to eliminate witnesses and assets that might compromise future operations." The realization sent a chill through both of them. The Empire wasn't just withdrawing from a failed military operation. They were preparing to eliminate anyone who might have information about their spy network, their tactics, or their future plans. That included not just Lyra, but anyone who had been in contact with her during her time at Haven. "How long do we have?" Caelum asked, his mind already working through evacuation procedures. "Not long," Lyra replied. "They move fast and they don't take prisoners. We need to get everyone out within the hour, or we'll be fighting a very different kind of battle." The evacuation was chaotic but efficient, with the rebellion's well-practiced emergency procedures carrying hundreds of people to safety in the deep forest sanctuaries. But as they moved through the night, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the Empire's agents were already in position to strike. Her fears were confirmed when the first explosions lit up the night sky behind them. Haven was burning, the beautiful tree city that had represented hope and possibility being reduced to ash and memory. The sight made her chest tighten with grief and rage, not just for the destruction, but for the realization that her presence had brought this catastrophe upon people who had done nothing but show her kindness. "This is my fault," she whispered, watching the flames consume everything they had built. "If I hadn't come here, if I hadn't compromised your security, stop," Caelum said firmly, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "You didn't choose to be sent here, and you didn't choose to be trained as a weapon. But you did choose to save us when it mattered most. That's what defines you now." As they reached the deep forest sanctuary, a hidden complex of caves and underground chambers that had been prepared for exactly this kind of emergency, Lyra found herself surrounded by the people she had come to care about. Children who had played in Haven's gardens, families who had found peace in its embrace, fighters who had believed in its promise of a better future. "What do we do now?" someone asked, voicing the question that hung in everyone's mind. Caelum stood before the assembled refugees, his presence commanding attention despite the circumstances. "We survive," he said simply. "We remember what we've lost, but we don't let it break us. We rebuild, we grow stronger, and we continue fighting for the world we want to create." "But how?" another voice called out. "They know where we are, they know our tactics, they know everything about us. Actually," Lyra said, stepping forward with a resolve she didn't know she possessed, "they don't know the most important thing. They don't know that their perfect weapon has chosen to fight against them. They don't know that we can use their own methods against them." Over the following days, as the rebellion regrouped and planned their next moves, Lyra found herself in a unique position. Her knowledge of Imperial tactics, intelligence networks, and strategic planning made her invaluable to the Resistance. But her presence also made everyone a target. She was simultaneously their greatest asset and their greatest liability. The solution came from an unexpected source. During one of the planning sessions, a young scout named Finn approached her with a proposal that was both brilliant and terrifying. "What if we don't hide from them?" he suggested. "What if we use their hunt for you as a weapon against them?" "Explain," Caelum said, his tactical mind already working through the implications. "They want her back," Finn continued. "They've committed resources to finding her, resources that could be used against other rebellion cells. If we can keep them chasing shadows, make them think she's somewhere she's not, we can protect our real operations while bleeding them dry." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Lyra would become a ghost, a phantom that appeared just long enough to lure Imperial forces into traps before vanishing again. Her knowledge of their methods would let her stay one step ahead, while her presence would force them to commit troops and resources to pursuing someone who was always somewhere else. "It's dangerous," Caelum warned. "If they catch you—" "They won't," Lyra interrupted, her voice carrying a confidence that surprised even her. "I know how they think, how they operate. And I have something they don't expect a reason to fight that goes beyond duty or fear." As they refined the plan over the following weeks, Lyra found herself working closely with Caelum in ways that had nothing to do with her original mission. They planned operations together, shared intelligence, and developed the kind of partnership that only came from complete trust and shared purpose. The attraction that had been building between them throughout her time at Haven deepened into something more profound, a connection that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. "Are you sure about this?" Caelum asked one evening as they finalized the details of their first major operation. "Once we start, there's no going back. The Empire will never stop hunting you." "I've been hunted my entire life," Lyra replied. "The only difference is now I'm choosing who I'm running from and who I'm running to." The first operation was a test of both their planning and their resolve. Using her knowledge of Imperial communication protocols, Lyra arranged for false intelligence to be leaked, suggesting that she was hiding in a remote mountain outpost. When the Imperial forces arrived in overwhelming numbers, they found only empty buildings and a message carved into the stone. "The hunter has become the hunted." The success of the operation sent shockwaves through the Empire's intelligence network. Their perfect weapon had not only defected but was actively working against them, using their own methods to make them look foolish. The response was swift, and brutal rewards were offered for information leading to her capture. Agents were deployed throughout the contested territories, and entire military units were reassigned to the hunt. But for every trap they set, Lyra was already 3 steps ahead. She led them on a merry chase through abandoned cities and forgotten battlefields, always appearing just long enough to remind them that she was still free before vanishing again. Each successful evasion was a victory not just for the rebellion, but for the idea that people could choose to be more than what they had been made to be. The real test came 3 months after the destruction of Haven, when intelligence reports suggested that the Empire was planning a major offensive against the rebellion's remaining strongholds. The operation was being coordinated by Commander Thorn himself, the man who had trained Lyra and sent her on her final mission. "He knows you better than anyone," Caelum warned as they studied the intelligence reports. "He'll anticipate your moves, prepare for your tactics. This isn't just another Imperial commander, this is someone who understands exactly how you think." "That works both ways," Lyra replied grimly. "I know his weaknesses too, his blind spots, his arrogance. He still thinks of me as his creation, his weapon. He can't imagine that I'd become someone he never trained me to be." The confrontation, when it came, was everything Lyra had expected and more. Thorn had indeed anticipated her involvement, had prepared traps and contingencies designed specifically to counter her abilities, but he had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated the power of fighting for something worth preserving. The battle took place in the ruins of an ancient city, its broken spires and crumbling walls providing cover for both sides. Lyra moved through the urban landscape like a ghost, using every skill she had ever learned to stay ahead of the forces hunting her. But this time, she wasn't alone. The rebellion fighters who accompanied her weren't just following orders, they were protecting someone they cared about, someone who had chosen to stand with them despite everything it cost her. The final confrontation came in what had once been the city's great cathedral, its soaring architecture now open to the sky. Thorn waited for her there, flanked by his elite guards, his scarred face set in the same expression of cold determination she remembered from countless training sessions. "Lyra Shadowmere," he said, his voice carrying the weight of disappointed authority. "You've caused us considerable trouble." "Good," she replied, her hand finding the grip of her weapon. "That was the idea." "You were my greatest success," Thorn continued, circling her slowly. "The perfect synthesis of human determination and Fae grace, shaped into the ultimate weapon. Do you really think you can throw all of that away for these rebels and their impossible dreams?" "I'm not throwing anything away," Lyra replied. "I'm finally becoming who I was meant to be, not who you made me." The fight that followed was brutal and precise, a deadly dance between teacher and student, creator and creation. Thorn was skilled and experienced, but Lyra had something he couldn't match: the absolute certainty that she was fighting for the right cause. When the battle ended, when the cathedral fell silent except for the sound of her breathing, she stood alone among the ruins of her past, but the victory came at a cost. The Empire's response to Thorn's death was swift and merciless, with massive military deployments and scorched earth tactics that pushed the rebellion to the brink of collapse. Safe houses were burned, supply lines were severed, and hundreds of innocent civilians were caught in the crossfire. "Maybe we should have left him alive," Caelum said as they studied the reports of Imperial reprisals. "The cost of his death might be too high." "No," Lyra replied firmly. "He would have kept hunting us, kept trying to destroy everything we've built. Sometimes the cost of victory is high, but the cost of surrender is higher." As the war entered its final phase, Lyra found herself at the center of a conflict that would determine the fate of both human and Fae civilizations. The Empire, desperate to maintain control, was preparing to unleash weapons that would devastate entire regions. The rebellion, pushed to the breaking point, was considering tactics that would violate everything they claimed to stand for. "There has to be another way," Caelum said during one of their strategy sessions. "We can't win by becoming the enemy we're fighting against." "What if we don't have to win?" Lyra suggested, an idea forming in her mind. "What if we can make them lose instead?" The plan she proposed was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Rather than trying to defeat the Empire militarily, they would expose its crimes to the world, reveal the true cost of its rule, and inspire people throughout the territories to rise up against their oppressors. It would require sacrifices from everyone involved, but it offered the possibility of real change rather than just another cycle of violence. The Empire's strength comes from fear and secrecy, Lyra explained to the assembled rebellion leaders. If we can strip away both, if we can show people that another way is possible, they'll lose their grip on power. The operation began with a series of coordinated strikes against Imperial communication centers, designed to open channels for broadcasting the truth about the war. Lyra led many of these missions herself, using her knowledge of Imperial security to achieve objectives that should have been impossible. But the real breakthrough came when they intercepted communications revealing the Empire's ultimate plan, a weapon that would drain the life force from entire regions, leaving them uninhabitable for generations. The revelation was so shocking that even some Imperial officials began to question their allegiance. "We have to stop them," Caelum said when they learned of the weapon's existence. "Whatever it takes, we can't let them use it." "We will," Lyra replied. "But not through more violence. We'll stop them by showing the world what they're willing to do for power." The final confrontation took place not on a battlefield, but in the halls of power themselves. Using her knowledge of Imperial protocols and her reputation as their former perfect weapon, Lyra infiltrated the capital city and revealed the truth about the Empire's crimes to the world. The broadcast went out on every channel, to every territory, carrying the voices of survivors and the evidence of atrocities. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Protests erupted in every major city, military units began refusing orders, and the careful structure of Imperial control began to crumble. Within days, the government that had ruled through fear and oppression for centuries was collapsing under the weight of its own crimes. But even as victory seemed within reach, Lyra found herself facing one final choice. The Empire's leaders, desperate to maintain power, offered her a deal return to their service, help them rebuild their control, and they would spare the lives of everyone she cared about. Refuse, and they would ensure that the transition to a new government was as bloody and chaotic as possible. "You know what they're asking," Caelum said as they stood together in the ruins of the Imperial Palace, watching smoke rise from the city below. "They want you to become their weapon again, to help them cling to power even as everything falls apart." "I know," Lyra replied. "And I know what my answer is." The rejection was swift and absolute. She had spent too long learning to be human, to be herself, to ever go back to being someone else's tool. The Empire could threaten her, could promise her rewards or punishments, but they could no longer control her. The war's end came not with a great battle, but with the quiet collapse of a system that had depended on fear and oppression for its survival. As the new government took shape, built on the principles of cooperation and mutual respect that the rebellion had championed, Lyra found herself facing the most difficult challenge of all, learning to live in peace. "What do we do now?" she asked Caelum one evening as they stood together on the balcony of their new home, watching the sun set over a world that was finally beginning to heal. "We build," he replied simply. "We help create the world we fought for, we raise the children who will inherit it, and we make sure that what we've learned is never forgotten." "And us?" she asked, her voice soft with possibility. "What do we become?" Caelum turned to face her, his eyes bright with love and hope. "We become whatever we choose to be," he said. "We become the people we were always meant to be, before the war, before the Empire, before everything that tried to make us less than we could be." As the stars appeared overhead, Lyra felt a peace she had never known before. She was no longer the Empire's perfect weapon, no longer a tool to be used and discarded. She was simply herself, a woman who had chosen love over duty, hope over fear, and the uncertain promise of the future over the bitter certainty of the past. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, moments when the old fears would surface, and the old training would tempt her back toward the familiar patterns of violence and control. But she would face them with Caelum at her side, with the community they had helped build around them, and with the knowledge that she had finally found something worth protecting. In the end, that was all anyone can ask for the chance to choose who they wanted to be, the opportunity to build something better than what they had inherited, and the hope that future generations would be able to say that their sacrifices had been worth it. The war was over, but the real work was just beginning. The work of healing, of rebuilding, of creating a world where no child would have to choose between duty and conscience, where no one would have to become a weapon to find their place in the world. It would take time, patience, and the kind of courage that came not from training or conditioning, but from the simple human desire to leave the world a little better than they had found it. As Lyra settled into Caelum's arms, watching the stars wheel overhead, she allowed herself to believe that they might actually succeed. The future was uncertain, full of challenges and possibilities in equal measure. But for the first time in her life, she was facing it as herself, with someone who loved her, not for what she could do, but for who she had chosen to become. The Empire's perfect weapon was gone, transformed into something far more dangerous, a woman who had learned to hope. And in a world that had forgotten the meaning of that word, hope was the most powerful weapon of all. Years passed in the new world they had helped create, and Lyra found herself taking on roles she had never imagined. She became a teacher, helping former Imperial soldiers learn to live without the structure of constant conflict. She became a healer, using her understanding of trauma and conditioning to help others recover from the war's psychological wounds. She became a leader, not through fear or authority, but through the quiet strength that came from having survived the impossible and chosen to build something better. Her relationship with Caelum deepened and evolved, growing from the intense connection forged in war into something more profound and lasting. They married in a ceremony that blended the human and Fae traditions, surrounded by the community they had helped save, and the friends who had become family. The celebration was simple but meaningful, a testament to the power of love to transcend the boundaries that had once seemed insurmountable. Children came, as they always do, bringing with them the promise of a future that would know only stories of the war that had shaped their parents' lives. Lyra watched them play in gardens that had been battlefields, learn lessons that emphasized cooperation over competition, and grow up believing that peace was the natural state of the world. But perhaps the most profound change was in Lyra herself. The nightmares that had plagued her for years gradually faded, replaced by dreams of possibility and growth. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive through countless missions gave way to a calm awareness of her surroundings. The emotional walls that had protected her from the pain of her circumstances slowly crumbled, allowing her to experience the full spectrum of human feeling. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the old patterns would reassert themselves, when stress or conflict would trigger responses that belonged to the weapon she had been rather than the person she had become. But she learned to recognize these moments, to breathe through them, and to choose consciously who she wanted to be in each situation. The world around them continued to change and grow. The new government, built on principles of justice and cooperation, faced challenges that tested its commitment to these ideals. Not everyone was ready to abandon the old ways, and there were those who profited from conflict and division. But the foundation was strong, rooted in the understanding that true strength came from diversity and mutual support rather than domination and fear. Lyra found herself called upon to help address these challenges, not as a warrior or a weapon, but as someone who understood both the cost of violence and the power of transformation. She became an ambassador of sorts, traveling to communities that were struggling with the transition from war to peace, sharing her story and helping others find their own paths to healing. Each journey reminded her of how far she had come, how much she had changed from the frightened assassin who had first approached Haven with death in her hands. The woman who returned home to Caelum and their children was someone she might not have recognized in those early days. Someone who laughed easily, who cried without shame, who loved without reservation. The scars remained, both physical and emotional, but they had become part of her story rather than the defining elements of her identity. They were reminders of where she had been, not limitations on where she could go. They were proof that survival was possible, that transformation was achievable, that even the most damaged heart could learn to hope again. As the years turned to decades, Lyra often found herself reflecting on the moments that had changed everything. The night she had stood behind Caelum with a poisoned blade in her hand, the choice to save rather than destroy, the decision to believe in something better than what she had known. Each memory was a reminder of the power of choice, of the fundamental human ability to become something more than what circumstances had made them. The Empire's perfect weapon had become something the Empire had never intended, that testament to the power of love to overcome conditioning, a proof that hope could survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it, a living example of the possibility of transformation. In choosing to save rather than destroy, she had discovered not just her own humanity, but the profound truth that change was always possible, no matter how impossible it might seem. The war was over, but the victory was ongoing, renewed every day by the choices of people who refused to accept that the world had to be defined by violence and fear. It was a victory written in the laughter of children who had never known war, in the love between people who had been taught to hate each other, in the quiet determination of those who chose to build rather than destroy. And at the center of it all was a woman who had learned the most important lesson of all, that the greatest weapon against hatred is not another weapon, but the courage to love in spite of everything that tries to make love impossible. The courage to choose hope over fear, trust over suspicion, and the uncertain promise of tomorrow over the bitter certainty of yesterday. The story of Lyra Shadowmere, the Empire's perfect weapon who chose to become something far more dangerous, would be told for generations to come. But the real story was being written every day in the lives of the people she had helped save, in the world she had helped build, and in the love that had transformed her from a weapon into a woman, from a tool into a human being, from someone who dealt in death into someone who chose life. It was a story without an ending, because the best stories never truly end. They inspire new chapters, new choices, new possibilities for transformation and growth. And in a world that had learned to hope again, that was the most powerful weapon of all. But darkness has a way of testing even the strongest light, and 20 years after the war's end, new shadows began to gather on the horizon. Reports trickled in from the far territories of strange phenomena, villages found empty with no signs of struggle, crops withering despite fertile soil, and an oppressive silence that seemed to drain the very life from Caelum, the land. At first, these incidents were dismissed as isolated problems, remnants of war-torn infrastructure struggling to recover. But as the pattern spread, moving steadily toward the heartland of the new republic, it became clear that something far more sinister was at work. Lyra first learned of the crisis during a council meeting in the capital, where representatives from across the territories had gathered to address what they were calling the Grey Blight. The name was apt. Witnesses described a creeping grayness that seemed to leach color and vitality from everything it touched, leaving behind empty husks of what had once been thriving communities. "It's not natural," reported Dr. Theron Brightwater, the Republic's chief magical researcher. "The residual energies we detected don't match any known magical phenomenon. Whatever is causing this, it's something entirely new." Caelum, now serving as the Republic's Minister of Defense, studied the maps with the same tactical precision that had made him legendary during the war. The affected areas formed a rough spiral pattern, expanding outward from a point deep in the Shadowlands, the contested region that had served as a no-man's land during the final years of the conflict. "It's systematic," he observed. "Not random destruction, but purposeful expansion. Something is deliberately draining these areas." "The question is what?" said Chancellor Sarah Nightingale, the human woman who had been elected to lead the new government. "And more importantly, how do we stop it?" Lyra found herself studying the patterns with a growing sense of unease. Something about the methodical nature of the expansion reminded her of imperial tactical doctrine, not the chaotic destruction of a natural disaster, but the calculated advance of a military campaign. But the Empire had been dismantled decades ago, its leaders either dead or absorbed into the new order. Who could be orchestrating something on this scale? The answer came 3 days later, delivered by a lone survivor who had somehow escaped the latest expansion of the Blight. The woman was barely conscious when she arrived at the capital, her body bearing strange marks that seemed to shift and writhe when observed directly. But her message was clear enough to send chills through everyone who heard it. "He's back," she whispered through cracked lips. "The Shadow Emperor. He's coming to reclaim what was taken from him." The name sent a collective shudder through the council chamber. The Shadow Emperor was more legend than history, a figure from the darkest period of the old empire, said to have been banished to the Void Realm for practicing forbidden magic. Most scholars believe he was a myth, a cautionary tale invented to discourage dabbling in the darkest arts. But if the survivor's words were true, the myth had somehow become reality. "That's impossible," Dr. Brightwater protested. "The Void Realm is sealed, has been for over 1,000 years. No one can return from there. Unless someone opened a door from this side," Lyra said quietly, pieces of a terrible puzzle beginning to fall into place in her mind. "The Empire's final weapon, project the one we stopped before they could deploy it. What if they weren't trying to create a weapon at all? What if they were trying to bring something back?" The implications were staggering. If the Empire's leaders had somehow managed to contact the Shadow Emperor in the Void Realm before their government collapsed, if they had found a way to facilitate his return in exchange for restoration of their power, then the Grey Blight wasn't just an invasion, it was a resurrection. "We need more information," Chancellor Nightingale decided. "Someone has to investigate the source of the Blight. Find out what we're really dealing with." "I'll go," Lyra volunteered immediately. "My knowledge of Imperial protocols might be crucial, and I have experience operating in hostile territory." "Absolutely not," Caelum replied firmly. "We have trained scouts, military reconnaissance teams. You're needed here, helping coordinate the response." But Lyra shook her head, her expression resolute. "Those teams won't survive what's out there. This isn't conventional warfare. It's something that requires unconventional solutions. And if the Shadow Emperor is really involved, then we need someone who understands how the, quote, Imperial mind works." The debate continued for hours, but in the end, necessity won out over caution. A small team was assembled: Lyra, two of the Republic's most experienced scouts, a military mage specializing in protective enchantments, and Dr. Brightwater himself, whose expertise in magical phenomena might prove crucial to understanding what they faced. Preparations took a week, time they could ill afford as reports continued to arrive of the Blight's expansion. Special equipment was crafted: protective talismans designed to ward off magical drain, communication crystals that could maintain contact across vast distances, and emergency teleportation devices that could extract the team if the situation became hopeless. But as they prepared to depart, Lyra found herself confronting emotions she hadn't experienced in decades. The old fears were returning, not the conditioned responses of her Imperial training, the deeper anxieties about leaving the life she had built, the family she cherished, the peace she had fought so hard to achieve. "You don't have to do this," Caelum told her the night before departure, as they stood together in their garden, watching their youngest daughter practice her magical exercises under the starlight. "Let someone else take the risk." "You know I do," Lyra replied softly. "This is what I was trained for, what I'm best at, and if we don't stop this now, there won't be a world left for our children to inherit." Their daughter, Arya, looked up from her practice with eyes that held the best of both her parent Scollum's wisdom and Lyra's determination. At 15, she was already showing signs of the extraordinary magical potential that came from her mixed heritage, but more importantly, she possessed the moral clarity that came from being raised in a world where loved P had triumphed over fear. "Mon's right," Arya said with the confidence of youth. "Sometimes the people who've seen the darkness are the only ones who can guide others through it." The wisdom in her daughter's words both warmed Lyra's heart and broke it. This was what they had fought for, a generation that could speak of courage and sacrifice without having lived through the horrors that had shaped their parents. The thought of potentially leaving this behind, of never seeing Arya grow into the remarkable woman she was becoming, was almost unbearable. But duty called, as it always had, though now it was duty to something far greater than any empire or ideology. It was duty to the future itself, to the possibility that children like Arya would never have to face the kind of choices that had defined Lyra's early life. The journey to the Shadowlands began at dawn, with the team traveling in a modified airship that could navigate the dangerous magical storms that surrounded the affected region. As they flew over landscapes that grew increasingly desolate, Lyra found herself remembering the first time she had entered enemy territory, the mixture of anticipation and terror. The hyper-awareness that came from knowing each moment might be her last. But this was different. She was no longer a weapon in someone else's war, but a guardian protecting everything she had come to value. The distinction mattered more than she had expected. lending a clarity to her purpose that had been absent in her younger years. The first sign of the blight appeared as they crossed into the outer territories, a subtle graying of the landscape below, as if someone had slowly drained the saturation from a painting. Trees stood leafless despite the season, their branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Rivers ran clear and lifeless, reflecting nothing but empty gray sky. "Magical readings are off the charts," Dr. Brightwater reported, studying his instruments with growing concern. "Whatever is causing this, it's unlike anything in the historical records. The energy signature is wrong somehow. Inverted." The airship's protective enchantments began to strain as they penetrated deeper into the blight zone, forcing them to land several miles from their intended destination. The silence that greeted them as they disembarked was profound, not just the absence of sound, but the absence of life itself. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, no wind rustled through the gray vegetation. "Stay close," Lyra instructed the team, her senses already adapting to the hostile environment. "And watch for shadows that move independently. If the old stories about the Shadow Emperor are true, his influence will manifest in ways that defy normal perception." They moved through the blighted landscape like ghosts themselves, following ancient paths that had once connected thriving settlements. The remains of villages they passed were intact, but empty houses with doors standing open, tables set for meals that had never been eaten, children's toys scattered in yards where no children would ever play again. "Where did they all go?" whispered Cael, one of the scouts, his usual bravado subdued by the oppressive atmosphere. "They're still here," Lyra replied grimly, pointing to shadows that seemed too dark, too substantial to be mere absence of light. "Look closer." As the team focused their enhanced vision on the shadows, shapes began to emerge, human forms trapped within the darkness, their faces frozen in expressions of confusion and loss. They were alive but not alive, existing but not existing, caught in some terrible state between being and nothingness. "The Shadow Emperor doesn't kill," Dr. Brightwater realized with horror. "He absorbs. He's turning them into extensions of himself, harvesting their life force while keeping their essence trapped in his realm." The revelation added urgency to their mission. This wasn't just about stopping an invasion, it was about saving thousands of souls from a fate worse than death. But as they pressed deeper into the blight zone, following the trail of devastation toward its source, Lyra began to sense something else. Patterns in the destruction, subtle signs that suggested intelligence and purpose beyond mere conquest. "He's building something," she said suddenly, stopping to examine a series of geometric marks carved into what had once been a marketplace. "These aren't random, they're architectural. He's using the absorbed life force to construct something in our reality." The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place as they followed the trail toward the epicenter of the blight. The Shadow Emperor wasn't just returning from the void realm, he was bringing it with him, using the life force of his victims to create a bridgehead between realities. If he succeeded, the distinction between the living world and the void would cease to exist. The source of the blight was revealed as they crested a ridge overlooking what had once been the city of Meridian, the last imperial stronghold to fall during the war. But where the city had stood, something else now rose from the blighted earth, structure that hurt to look at directly, its geometry following rules that had no place in their reality. The Void Citadel, as Lyra found herself thinking of it, was both magnificent and terrible. Spires twisted through dimensions that shouldn't exist, walls curved in directions that made no sense, and at its heart, a throne room where shadows gathered like courtiers before their dark lord. "By all the gods," Dr. Brightwater breathed, his instruments sparking and failing as they tried to process readings that defied every law of magical physics. "He's not just building a fortress, he's creating a new reality, one where he is the fundamental force." As they watched from their concealment, figures began to emerge from the citadel, not the shadow-trapped victims they had seen in the villages, but something worse. These were the Shadow Emperor's true servants, beings that had been so thoroughly absorbed into his essence that they had become extensions of his will. They moved with purpose, spreading out across the landscape in patterns that would accelerate the blight's expansion. "We have to get closer," Lyra decided, though every instinct screamed against approaching the citadel. We need to understand how this process works before we can hope to stop it. The infiltration was the most dangerous operation Lyra had undertaken since her imperial days, requiring all her skills in stealth and misdirection. But as they crept through the outer reaches of the citadel, avoiding patrols of shadow servants and navigating passages that seemed to shift when not directly observed, she began to understand the true scope of the Shadow Precaret, Emperor's plan. He wasn't just conquering their world, he was remaking it in his image, turning reality itself into an extension of the Void Realm. Every person absorbed, every structure corrupted, every natural law twisted brought him closer to his goal of absolute dominion over existence itself. The throne room, when they finally reached it, was a revelation of horror and majesty. The Shadow Emperor sat upon a seat carved from crystallized void, his form both there and not there, substantial and incorporeal. He was beautiful in the way that black holes were beautiful, a perfect manifestation of entropy and ending, drawing all light and life into himself. But as Lyra studied him from their hiding place, she realized something that changed everything. The Shadow Emperor was not complete. Despite his power, despite the reality-warping scope of his ambition, he was still partially bound by the rules of the Void Realm. He needed something from their world, some final component that would allow him to fully manifest in their reality. The answer came as she observed the patterns of energy flowing through the citadel. The Shadow Emperor was feeding on life force, yes, but not just any life force. He needed the essence of someone who had bridged two worlds, someone who had been shaped by both light and darkness, order and chaos. He needed someone exactly like her. "He's been waiting for me," she whispered to her companions, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "All of this, the blight, the citadel, it's all been designed to draw me here. He needs my life force to complete his transformation." Dr. Brightwater's face went pale as he understood the implications. The mixed heritage, the imperial conditioning combined with your choice to embrace hope, you're a perfect synthesis of opposing forces. If he absorbs you, he becomes unstoppable, Lyra finished. Able to exist fully in our reality, while retaining all his Void Realm powers. The knowledge should have filled her with despair, but instead, Lyra felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time since learning of the crisis, she had a clear understanding of the enemy's goal and her role in stopping it. The Shadow Emperor had made the same mistake the Empire had made all those years ago. He had underestimated the power of choice. "There's another way," she said, her mind racing through possibilities. "If he needs my essence to complete his transformation, then I can use that against him. But I'll need to get closer than anyone should survive." "Lyra, no," came Caelum's voice through the communication crystal, having overheard their conversation from the distant command center. "Whatever you're thinking, there has to be another way." "There isn't," she replied gently, touching the crystal with fingers that didn't shake despite the magnitude of what she was contemplating. "But this isn't suicide, my love. This is transformation. He expects to absorb a weapon, someone broken by imperial conditioning. Instead, he's going to encounter someone who has learned to love, to hope, to choose light over darkness. That contradiction might be enough to destabilize his entire existence. The plan was desperate, dangerous, and dependent on too many unknowns to calculate properly." But as Lyra prepared to leave her concealment and approach the throne, she found herself thinking not of the risks but of the people she was protecting. Caelum, their children, the communities they had helped build, the future they had fought to create, all of it hung in the balance. She moved through the throne room with the confidence of someone who belonged there, her imperial training allowing her to project the arrogance and authority that the shadow servants expected to see. The Shadow Emperor watched her approach with eyes that held the depth of eternity and the hunger of the void. "Lyra Shadowmere," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in dimensions beyond hearing. "The Empire's perfect weapon, come at last to fulfill her true purpose." "I'm not their weapon anymore," she replied, stopping just beyond the reach of the shadows that writhed around his throne. "I haven't been for a very long time." "No," the Shadow Emperor agreed, rising from his seat with fluid grace. You are something far more valuable. You are the bridge between order and chaos, the synthesis of opposing forces that will allow me to remake existence itself. Your willing participation would be optimal. Optimal. And if I refuse? That I will take what I need regardless, he replied with the casual certainty of absolute power. But the process will be more traumatic for you, and for the reality I am reshaping. Lyra felt the weight of the moment settle around her like a shroud. Everything she had experienced, every choice she had made, every person she had loved, all of it, had led to this confrontation in a throne room that existed partially outside reality. But as the Shadow Emperor began to extend tendrils of void energy toward her, she did something he didn't expect. She smiled. "You've made the same mistake everyone else has made," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to push back against the oppressive darkness. "You think I'm defined by what was done to me, by the conditioning and the training and the weapons I've carried, but that's not who I am." The void tendrils hesitated, as if confused by her lack of fear. "I am someone who chose love over duty, hope over despair, creation over destruction. I am someone who learned that the greatest strength comes not from taking power, but from giving it away. And I am someone who understands that sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to play the game by the enemy's rules." End quote. As she spoke, Lyra began to glow with a light that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with the choices she had made. The radiance grew stronger with each word, each memory of kindness chosen over cruelty, each moment when she had decided to build rather than destroy. The Shadow Emperor recoiled, his perfect features contorting with something that might have been pain. "Impossible," he snarled. "You cannot resist the void. Nothing can resist the void." "You're right," Lyra agreed, her light growing brighter still. "Nothing can resist the void. But love isn't nothing, it's everything. It's the force that creates meaning from chaos, hope from despair, connection from isolation. And that's something you've never understood." The confrontation that followed was unlike any battle ever fought. It wasn't a clash of weapons or magic, but a contest between fundamental forces: entropy against creation, despair against hope, the void's hunger against love's abundance. The throne room became a nexus of competing realities as the Shadow Emperor's nature warred against Lyra's chosen identity. Dr. Brightwater and the team watched in awe and terror as the very fabric of existence seemed to bend and stretch around the two figures at the chamber's heart. Space folded in on itself, time moved in stuttering loops, and the boundaries between what was real and what was possible became increasingly meaningless. But gradually, impossibly, Lyra began to win. Not through overpowering her opponent, but by refusing to be defined by his rules. Every tendril of void energy that touched her was transformed, converted from destructive hunger into creative potential. Every shadow that tried to engulf her became light. Every whisper of despair became a psalm of hope. The Shadow Emperor, creature of pure void that he was, couldn't comprehend what was happening. His entire existence was predicated on the principle that all things ultimately fell to entropy, that order inevitably gave way to chaos. But Lyra represented something outside his understanding: the idea that consciousness could choose to create meaning even in the face of meaninglessness. "What are you?" he demanded, his form beginning to destabilize as the contradictions inherent in Lyra's nature spread through his carefully constructed reality. "I'm what you could have been," she replied with infinite compassion. "I'm what anyone can become when they choose love over power, hope over certainty, growth over stagnation. I'm the possibility you rejected when you embraced the void." The citadel began to collapse as the Shadow Emperor's hold on reality weakened. The geometric impossibilities that had defined its structure started to resolve into normal three-dimensional space, the twisted spires straightening, the dimensional curves flattening into comprehensible blur. Angles. Throughout the blighted lands, color began to return as the life force that had been stolen was gradually released back into the world. But the most profound change was in the Shadow Emperor himself. As Lyra's influence spread through his being, cracks began to appear in his void-touched perfection. Through those cracks, Glimpses of what he had once been became visible, not a creature of pure entropy, but someone who had once been capable of love, hope, and the choice to create rather than destroy. "I remember," he whispered, his voice losing its otherworldly harmonics and becoming simply, heartbreakingly human. "I remember what I was before the void claimed me. I remember choosing this." "Then you can choose differently," Lyra offered, extending her hand toward the crumbling figure on the throne. "It's never too late to choose love over fear, hope over despair. The void taught you that destruction was inevitable, but that was a lie. Creation is always possible." For a moment that stretched across eternity, the Shadow Emperor stared at her outstretched hand. In his eyes, she could see the war between the creature he had become and the person he had once been. The void fought to maintain its hold, whispered that he was too far gone, too corrupted, too steeped in darkness to ever find his way back to the light. But love, Lyra had learned, was stronger than conditioning. Hope was more powerful than despair. And the choice to become something better was always available, no matter how far someone had fallen. The Shadow Emperor reached out and took her hand. The explosion of light that followed was visible from space, a burst of pure creative energy that swept across the blighted lands like a cleansing wave. Where it passed, the gray desolation gave way to vibrant life forests, but had been drained of color burst into bloom. Rivers that had run lifeless began to sparkle with renewed vitality, and throughout the affected regions, the shadow-trapped victims were released from their prison between existence and void. When the light finally faded, Lyra found herself standing in a meadow where the void citadel had been, surrounded by flowers that seemed to glow with their own inner radiance. Beside her stood not the Shadow Emperor, but a man who might have been his brother's similar features, but unmarked by the terrible hunger of the void, eyes that held memory of darkness, but had chosen to look toward the light. "My name was Marcus," he said softly, his voice still carrying echoes of the power he had wielded but tempered now by hard-won wisdom. "Before the void, before the Empire found me and convinced me that power was the only thing that mattered, I was just Marcus. What will you do now?" Lyra asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "Learn," Marcus replied, looking around at the transformed landscape with wonder. "Learn to be human again, to choose hope over despair, to build rather than destroy. It won't be easy, the void's teachings run deep, but you've shown me it's possible." In the distance, she could see Dr. Brightwater and the others approaching, their faces bright with relief and amazement. Beyond them, the communication crystal was practically vibrating with messages from the capital, where magical sensors had detected the massive shift in energy. Soon, there would be celebrations, investigations, long discussions about how to integrate a reformed Shadow Emperor into their society. But for now, Lyra simply stood in the meadow of impossible flowers, feeling the warmth of sunlight on her face and the deep satisfaction of a mission truly completed. She had been sent to kill a Fae general, and had discovered love instead. She had been trained as a weapon, and had chosen to become a healer. She had faced the embodiment of entropy itself, and had offered it the possibility of redemption. The pattern was clear now, woven throughout the tapestry of her life like a recurring melody. Over and over, she had been given the choice between destruction and creation, between fear and love, between accepting what she had been made to be and choosing what she wanted to become. And over, she had chosen the harder path, the one that led toward hope rather than despair. As she began the journey home to Caelum and their children, to the life they had built together and the future they continued to create, Lyra reflected on the nature of transformation. It wasn't a single moment of dramatic change, but a series of small choices, each one building on the last, each one moving incrementally toward the light. The Shadow Emperor's redemption would be a long process, just as her own had been. But the possibility was there, shining like a beacon in the darkness. The world she returned to was subtly but fundamentally changed. The crisis had revealed hidden strengths in their society, had shown that the principles they had fought for were more than mere idealism, were practical tools for facing the impossible. Communities that had never worked together before found common cause in the recovery effort. Former enemies discovered they could stand side by side when facing a threat to existence itself. More importantly, the next generation had seen their parents' values tested against the ultimate challenge and had watched them prevail. Children like Arya would grow up knowing that hope wasn't naive optimism, but a powerful force capable of transforming even the darkest realities. They would understand that love wasn't weakness but the greatest strength anyone could possess. The epilogue to Lyra's story was still being written, would always be being written as long as people chose to love rather than hate, to build rather than destroy, to offer redemption rather than demand revenge. She had begun as the Empire's perfect weapon, and had become something far more dangerous, a living proof that transformation was always possible, that no one was too far gone to find their way back to the light. In the garden of their home, under stars that shone with renewed brilliance in a sky no longer threatened by the void, Lyra sat with her family and told them the story of how a Shadow Emperor learned to hope again. It was a story about the power of choice, about the courage required to love in the face of hatred, about the fundamental truth that creation was always stronger than destruction. And in the telling, she realized that our own story was far from over. There would be new challenges, new opportunities to choose light over darkness, new chances to prove that love could triumph over any force arrayed against it. The perfect weapon had become the perfect guardian, not of any empire or ideology, but of the possibility that the future could always be better than the past. The war was truly over now, not just the military conflict, but the deeper struggle between hope and despair that had defined so much of her life. In its place was something far more precious, the peace that came from knowing who she was, what she stood for, and what legacy she wanted to leave for the generations that would follow. As the night deepened and her family drifted off to sleep around her, Lyra remained in the garden, watching the stars and thinking about transformation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose growth over stagnation, new chances to prove that love was indeed the most powerful force in any reality. But tonight, she was simply grateful for the journey that had brought her here, for the people who had shown her what love truly meant, and for the endless possibility that tomorrow could always be better than today. The story continued, as the best stories always do, in the choices made by people who refused to accept that the world had to be defined by its darkest impulses. It continued in every act of kindness, every moment of courage, every decision to hope rather than despair. And at its heart was a simple truth, but no amount of conditioning or trauma could ever completely erase that love, once awakened, had the power to transform anything it touched. The Empire's perfect weapon had become something the Empire could never have imagined, a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit, and proof that no one, no matter how broken or lost, was beyond the reach of Tain. Redemption. In choosing love over duty, hope over fear, and transformation over stagnation, she had not only saved herself but had shown countless others the way forward. And in a universe that too often seemed dominated by darkness, that was perhaps the greatest victory of all.